It is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to today's opening ceremony for Governance Week 2022, entitled Developing the Conscience of the Board. As Faye mentioned, I am Kamala Rampersad de Silva, and I am the CEO of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. In welcoming all of you, I want to share that the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute is a nonprofit membership organization, and we welcome everyone who wishes to join in our purpose of improving corporate governance practices in the region. Governance is an absolutely fascinating and vital subject, and many of its practices has changed significantly over the years. Today, we are seeing yet another perspective as the ESG conversation occupies front stage. The key focus today is to get directors to take responsibility for future generations and engage in sustainable practices that protects the future of the firm. This is pretty much what the Brundtland Commission had recommended in 1987, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own. Many are preoccupied today with the ESG elements and metrics, particularly relating to climate change and impact on the planet. But previous threats have not gone away. In 1776, Adam Smith wrote that managers would not watch over other people's money with the same vigilance as they watch over their own. The rise of the professional director has brought this centuries-old advice to even greater relevance. In 1932, Burl and Means warned about the continued separation of ownership from those in control, saying that the interest of the owners most emphatically will not be served by a profit-seeking controlling group. They went on to estimate that trillions of shareholders' dollars had been lost to self-serving directors. A few decades later, people like Edward Freeman and John Elkington again raised the urgency for boardrooms to focus away from pure profits and take into account people and planet. And now we have the more recent 37,000 ISO standard for good governance, the first of its kind, which is not strictly a standard, but guidelines for creating effective governance in the boardroom that focuses on value creation and purpose. So directors today are charged with a lot of responsibility to guard against self-interest and supervise the management team, to understand the needs of the company and the purpose for which it was created, to measure impact on the environment and develop metrics which will allow it to proactively protect people and planet, while also keeping the firm on an even keel in the midst of rising inflation, falling currencies, and an unpredictable supply chain distressed by both COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Clearly, it is not an easy task, and one for which a lot of directors are not properly equipped. Here at the Corporate Caribbean Governance Institute, we have taken our task very seriously to raise awareness and build competence by engaging in a wide range of workshops, sessions, and conferences, including the Great Wealth Transfer Conference and the meetings of the International Learning Network, both held recently. Governance Week, however, is our signature event. Here, we bring together over 50 professionals from the Caribbean region to share, grow, and learn from each other over a 5-day period. Our theme encapsulates many of the issues above in a very simple theme, developing the conscience of the board, which very directly addresses the need for directors to be deliberate in their intentions, to be stewards, looking after the interest of the organization, its people, and stakeholders inclusive of the planet. For our inaugural Governance Week in 2020, we were extremely fortunate to have Professor Bob Garrett delivering our opening keynote. As Faye said, Professor Garrett has since become a friend and advisor to the Institute, and he was instrumental in us being able to organize the very eminent Professor Mervyn King as our keynote speaker last year. I should add that Professor Garrett also introduced us to Charlotte Vallet, who will be delivering our opening keynote this year. Thank you so much, Professor Garrett. We are very happy to welcome Charlotte, who has served as chair of the Institute of Directors in the UK, and who has founded and is the managing director of the Global Governance Group. Charlotte has a passion for assisting smaller governance institutes like ours, and we look forward not just to her address today, but to future collaborations with her. Now, some brief housekeeping announcements before we move on, especially for those of you who are joining us for the first time. We are in a Zoom meeting room and not a webinar. This means everyone is together in the same virtual space to be able to see and communicate with each other. It allows us to feel more connected. It's important, therefore, that we know who is in the room with us. And so we ask that persons identify themselves properly on their devices. To do this, you can rename yourself, or if you're unable to do so, please message us in the chat and we would assist in renaming you. If we cannot identify who you are, then you will be removed from the meeting room. Also, we would like everyone to keep their microphones on mute during the presentation and panel discussion. For those of you who are new to Zoom, there's an icon at the bottom of your screen to raise your hands when you want to get our attention for the Q&A segment afterwards. You will need to unmute yourself and press the mute icon again as soon as you are done to minimize any disruptive noises if you are invited to speak. During the entire session, however, you are welcome to make remarks or ask questions in the chat feature during the session. This session is being recorded, as all of our public are, and will be made available afterwards on our social media pages and will also be sent to you. Those of you who need to earn CPDs or PDUs as part of your ongoing certification, you may use our CCGI sessions to claim your points. In order to do so, however, you need to have been registered for the session and you need to send us an email requesting the same. We would verify your attendance at the session before issuing a certificate with or PDU hours. As I close, I would like to extend sincere appreciation to our sponsors. First Citizens Bank, our gold sponsor, Republic Bank Limited, our silver sponsor, and our 3 bronze sponsors, JMMB Group, PwC, and Angostura Limited. We thank them sincerely for their support, and we look forward to building a long-term relationship with them and other corporate bodies that are interested in helping us to engage the conversation and training to help build effectiveness in the boardroom. Over the next 5 days, over 50 professionals from around the region will be offering insights and advice on how we may improve our governance practices. I also want to extend sincere appreciation to all of them, our speakers, panelists, and moderators, who will be given of their time over the next 5 days. Thank you for believing in us at CCGI and for agreeing to contribute to our collective development. We look forward to all the many stimulating conversations which will follow. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kamala. Thank you very much for that. It was warm welcoming remarks. I would now like to introduce Ms. Christina Jagdeo, who is the Manager, Corporate Ethics and Governance at First Citizens Bank, our gold sponsor. Christina.
Thank you for that very warm opening remark, Mrs. Rampersad de Silva, and I could definitely share with you her passion for governance really speaks volumes. And just a little tidbit, this is not part of my opening remark, but just on a personal note, I wanted this room to know that Mrs. Rampersad de Silva was actually my individual coach and lecturer for governance at CTS when I had completed my MBA. So I know personally of her work, and I know personally of her dedication and her passion, and definitely her drive when it comes to governance and for really trying to improve governance in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. So let me jump right into the citizens' opening remarks. So good afternoon, everyone. Mrs. Charlotte Vallet, featured speaker for Governance Week 2022. Ms. Faye Collymore Lopez Collymore, Chairman of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute and member of the Board of Directors, Mr. Nigel Romano, Chairman, Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, Mrs. Kamla Rampersad de Silva, CEO of Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, Professor Bob Garrett, panelists and participants of Governance Week, and ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the start of Caribbean Corporate Governance Week. As founding sponsor of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, it is always a pleasure for First Citizens to participate and advocate for the excellent work of the CCGI. I am therefore very pleased to bring greetings to you at what we consider a very timely and relevant forum for all businesses. At First Citizens, integrity is actually one of our core values, and we hold everyone from day-to-day banker to the esteemed board member to account. One of the tenets of our integrity core value is conscious choice. And it's very interesting because we're talking about a board and board having a conscience. And conscious choice is part of integrity. And that is to say, we value the extent to which we actively choose to take or rectify a course of action. And then consistency, which means showing steadiness of character and what it takes to behave positively in what might be less than ideal environments. And these are two of our integrity hallmarks under which we operate. In the context of this week's conference theme, it would be relevant, therefore, to consider that it is upon these two ideals of an organizational conscience that boards and organizations as a whole can be tested. From our own experience, not only developing, but sustaining the right behaviors, not from the board level alone, but from all levels, is where the true challenge lies. Throughout most of 2020, and of course part of 2021, I think we all could agree that it was business unusual, and our efforts to embrace innovation were accelerated in order to maintain our commitment to our employees, to our shareholders, and to our regulators. After all, what would the real value of our principles have amounted to if we were inflexible in our willingness to adapt and inconsistent in our pursuit of excellence? With this in mind, of course, we make it a priority to examine our operations against our established principles on an ongoing basis, seeking new ways through which we can strengthen our compliance and governance frameworks. Only a few weeks ago, as a matter of fact, we took time as a group to orient the board of First Citizens Foundation, which is an NGO, and its subcommittees to our new thrust towards establishing an environmental, social, and governance, or ESG program. The foundation, which holds responsibility for upholding good governance and transparency in the management of corporate social responsibility initiatives, will oversee our goal of ensuring that our investments are made in accordance with best practice for responsible investing, and that the control mechanisms to do so are robust and functional. This and other routine compliance measures, such as mandatory reviews of employee code of conduct, routine ethics training for all staff, and by routine, of course, I mean annual, speaks of the values that we embody and encourage. We encourage honesty, fair play, and exemplary leadership. It is therefore our hope that this week's discussions and analysis from speakers, panelists, and participants alike will inspire a renewed resolve towards demonstrating these principles from the boardroom and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, we look forward to another successful edition of this Governance Week, and we truly believe that critical to the advancement of the profession and to the work of its practitioners is a platform for the exchange of ideas. First Citizens, therefore, commends the team at CCGI for ensuring that such an avenue is alive and active and continues to be alive and active. And we wish each of you a productive and successful Governance Week 2022. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you very much. I would now like to thank Christina for her welcome remarks and also echo Kamla's thanks to First Citizens for their continued support of our initiatives and their support as school sponsor for this event. I would like to now introduce Professor Bob Garrett, who I know is no stranger to any of us in the room. And as we we have said before, a great friend and supporter of the Institute. And Professor Garrett will be providing some welcoming remarks to this year's edition of Governance Week. I will, of course, still want to say a few words about Professor Garrett's background, although he needs a little by way of introduction. He's an international consultant and academic specializing in the review and development of boards of directors and works on 5 continents. He's best known for his long-selling book, The Fish Rots from the Head, Developing Effective Directors. His life spans architectural education, action learning-based community development, the founding of the first MBA program in China, the founding of the Asian Management Center in Brunei, Dar es Salaam, and many board development processes in private, family, state, and not-for-profit businesses. He was a visiting professor at Imperial College London, and currently is an honorary visiting professor at Cass Business School, London University, and professor extraordinaire at Stellenbosch Business School in South Africa. Professor Garrett, we are deeply grateful that you have made yourself available to come and provide some welcoming remarks to our community this afternoon. And what I would also like to once again thank you so much for your support and ask you to take the mic now and provide your welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Fee. And greetings from one of the few good days in English weather. Today is one of those beautifully warm, long summer evenings. Not a cloud in the sky, and it's now 9 o'clock in the evening. It's still bright daylight. We won't have dusk until at least another hour and a half, and it's just quite amazing. So I'm feeling pretty good. But on the other hand, I'm very worried, as ever, on the corporate governance side. I won't steal any of Charlotte's thunder. I won't go into that side, the intellectual and the behavioral and the value side of things at the moment. But I am worried that as we just about come out of COVID, we're now beginning to see international recession looming on all sorts of fronts. And even more worrying is the possibility, I put it no more than that, of war as well, particularly in Eastern and Western Europe, but rolling over to the States, etc. So these things are big, big issues for the conscience of a board. We may not be able to do very much about them, so I'm looking forward to what Charlotte has to say to help us understand what particular contributions we as a board can make. The other thing I'd say, slightly separately from that, is that I'm delighted that on Tuesday, Ronelle Dathan-Baird is going to give a fairly radical talk. It's radical in the sense that it's actually based on hard facts. And her report of the attitudes and behaviors of directors across at least the Eastern Caribbean is, I think, absolutely unique and very much needed to begin to let us see exactly the gap between what people say and what people actually do. And first of all, I really appreciate Ronelle for doing that, because it's a bit of a shock to me, and I'm sure to many others, as to what has come out of that report, but I'm delighted it provides a benchmark. And I think if we can balance ourselves between worrying rightly about the conscience and also trying to develop the facts, we'll have a really good 5 days. So thank you, Fee. I will now pass over to the real meat of the session.
Thank you very much, Professor Garrett. It's now my pleasure to call on our chairman to deliver greetings on behalf of the Institute. Our chairman, Mr. Nigel Romano, is a long-standing member and director of the Institute, and he took the role of chairman from January 1st, 2020. He's a banker and chartered accountant with extensive experience in public accounting and banking across the globe, and is also a seasoned director and chairman of both public company boards as well as nonprofit organizations. As applies to all of us who serve on the Institute's board, Nigel shares this passion for corporate governance. Nigel, I invite you to turn on your mic and give us your welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Faye. Good afternoon and good evening, and thank you, Professor Garrett, for bringing a ray of sunlight, because I can see the sun outside right now, and hopefully it will stay that way for a little while. Developing the conscience of the board. This is, for me, a most appropriate theme, because the Oxford Dictionary defines conscience as a person's moral sense of right and wrong. It's viewed as acting as a guide to one's behavior. Good governance should ensure that board members and the teams that they guide are clear about what is right and wrong for their organizations, because I think it is contextual, it applies in the organizational setting. And right and wrong in an organizational context must be based on the organization's defined purpose, its raison d'etre, its reason for existence, and the core values that drive its behavior to ensure the creation of value for its stakeholders in a way that is consistent with those core values. By the end of this week, we hope that organizations of all shapes and sizes, private, public, family-owned conglomerates, or SMEs, will have a better appreciation for the role of purpose, their value proposition, their core values and ethics, the elements of, if you will, of an organization's conscience in the sustainable success of their organizations. I certainly look forward to learning and growing with all the participants this week, and I cannot wait to hear from Charlotte. So without further ado, Faye, over to you and Charlotte's opening address. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nigel. Yes. Charlotte, we now turn to our feature address, and it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Ms. Charlotte Vallejo, who will give the feature opening address for our Governance Week. Let me say a few words about Charlotte's background before I hand over to her to give her address. So those of you who are not familiar with her, to get to know her a little bit. She has over 35 years of experience in finance, primarily as an investment banker in Denmark and the UK. She has an extensive portfolio career with a number of non-executive directorships and chairman roles, as well as delivering training and advising boards in corporate governance through her company, Global Governance Group. Charlotte's board role in listed organizations have taken in chair of Kennedy Wilson Europe Real Estate PLC, non-executive director of 3i Infrastructure PLC, and chair of Blackstone GSO Loan Financing Limited. Her experience with unlisted organizations includes being a non-executive director of the international engineering firm Lang O'Rourke and chair of the Institute of Directors in the UK. She's the founder and chair of Board Apprentice, a not-for-profit organization set up to improve the pipeline and diversity of board-ready directors. So, Charlotte, we are deeply grateful that on this lovely summer day that Professor Garrett has described, you have given up some of your time to come and share with us and kick off our Governance Week. So I'll invite you to take the mic and address us now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to just share some slides that I'm going to speak from that can be shared afterwards so that you can all get the finer details out. So there should be no reason to take too many notes. So let me see that I can get it right there with the sharing. So I'm going to talk to you today about ethics, integrity, and purpose, which is very much fitting in with what the whole week is going to be about. I'm really, really delighted and honored to be here and to open this week of 2022. It's been an excellent theme, I have to say, to pick the theme, developing the conscience of the board. I couldn't have chosen it better myself, and it is some of my pet things, is ethics, values, morale, because I find them very, very important in leadership. It's absolutely key for boards to lead and be role models for doing the right thing. Just as Nigel was mentioning, it is something that really, in these current times, we should be very, very aware of. As leaders, again, when we hold ourselves out as board members, we hold ourselves out as leaders as well. This has always been the case as such, but I feel that boards are becoming more and more visible, and the role that they're taking as directors is becoming more and more important and spotlighted. And what I do see is often a number of directors being a bit caught like rabbits in the headlights when confronted with specific issues where they might not have been as ethical as they should have had, or where their integrity might not have played in as much as it should. So I hope it will be a good starting point what I talk about for the coming week's presentations and discussions. Ethics is something I've spoken about on many occasions. It's something that I grew up with, I think, as a natural part of the Danish culture where I come from. As I started a career as an investment banker in the early 80s, I started to see all the various ways of ethics and how it can play a role, or not, as it were, especially in that industry, I would say. One thing is following the law. A whole other thing is to behave ethically within the law and applying the law ethically and in the spirit that it is written. And I think that is where I have seen again and again, things might have become a bit convoluted in an attempt to sort of following the law and sort of doing the right thing, but not doing it anyway. It's really clear to me that everything that is legal is not ethical. And spending a lot of time looking for loopholes, for example, in the law to take advantage of those for the wrong reasons is more often than not ethical, sometimes not even legal. An interesting example I came across a few years ago was in an investment fund I was working with a sale of a company. We bought a company, but realized that it was fraudulent in its finances, and it was only discovered subsequently. The investors of the fund that had sold it to us had already received the proceeds of the sale. At the time, they didn't know that the sale was based on fraudulent financials. The buyer that I was on the board of in the end had a court ruling clearly stating that fraud had happened, but the proceeds had already been paid out to the investors. We went forward to appeal to those investors to, based on morale and ethics, pay back the proceeds they have received because they were based on fraud. It took some toing and froing, but in the end, the receivers of money coming from fraud felt that it was too big a reputational risk for them to keep the money, even though in the law, in principle, they could have, and they paid back the money that they had received from the fraudulent sale of the company, which was a good solution to that, but it did take a while, a year, to actually get through to that, and actually having to really push in on the ethical aspects of it when you had received money that was derived from fraudulent business. Another example that was interesting is another private equity situation with an educational institution. The education institution had unfortunately gone bankrupt, and there was no value left in it, and it was being liquidated. Employees came forward with some extra payments they asked for, which was not part of the liquidation and which was not in the law required to be paid out. But in the name of doing the right thing and ethics, the private equity company chose to pay out to those employees, and the investors within that fund. I've specifically invested with that manager because they know they will behave ethically. So ethics can be driven in the right way, also in a hard-nosed investment environment. And I think that's something that's worth paying heed to, which is why I wanted to put those two examples forward. So how do boards discharge financial, social, and environmental duties ethically and with integrity? And I think we're all used to hearing about money laundering, bribery, and financial misrepresentation. Those issues in themselves are serious breaches of the law, and any organization engaging in any of those are clear-cut not behaving ethically. I think we are very clear on that these days. These days, it will be really hard for any board of directors to claim ignorance if any of this is uncovered. they're relatively sure to be deemed negligent and have legal charges against them. And definitely, again, fish rots from the head, Professor Garrett. It's clearly that the board should be leading on this, and if they don't, it will feed throughout the company for sure. New areas of laundering are taken over focus right now. Greenwashing, interesting that we call it washing instead of laundering. Maybe we should call it green laundering, but we call it greenwashing. Diversity washing, social washing, equality washing, and general misrepresentation of ESG metrics. How are businesses managing those kind of issues? Well, not always that well. We've had a recent issue with a company called DWS in Germany that's 80% owned by Deutsche Bank. And that is a very large asset manager who had their offices raided by 50 police officers earlier this month, so not far away, investigating claims of greenwashing. Apparently, their 2020 annual report claimed that $459 billion of their $900 billion assets were invested using ESG criteria. This has been claimed to not be true, and that was what the investigation was about. And effectively, the potential here is prospectus fraud and misrepresentation to the people that has bought in or invested in their assets that they are holding. So this is a very serious issue. The CEO resigned straight away, and obviously the board is going to look very long and hard on what are we saying against what we are actually doing. It's not words, they don't really count if you have no real actions and evidence behind it. And this is something that directors and board needs to be very, very aware of. Social washing is when a business makes misleading claims about the social responsibility of its products or services just to position themselves in a better light for economic gains and public image. Social washing also includes some misleading marketing practices that are coming up. Something called blue washing, for example, misrepresenting following the United Nations Global Impact 10 principles. We have rainbow washing, misuse of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, and pink washing, which is making deceptive LGBTQ plus claims. That's just some. It all adds into the whole mass of laundry that's going on here, but this is relatively new on the agenda, but something that directors has to be really, really clear on. Of course, governance washing, if you want, has happened for decades. Businesses are saying they do something, but they have no actual evidence to back it up. Don't say you follow a specific code of corporate governance and not actually do it. Don't say you have good risk management when a risk matrix doesn't exist, et cetera, et cetera. All these kind of things are pretty important to ensure that you get right. Ideally, directors will serve with integrity and ethics. It's not hard to do, and I think everybody do understand right from wrong, but there are of course many gray areas. Personally, I prefer to conduct business in a clear sort of it's right or wrong way. I don't really like gray areas at all. It's not how my mind works. For me, it's very clear that it's either right or it's wrong. If the board need to have really long discussions about how to present something in a very convoluted way, then you're probably on the wrong track. As soon as there's something the board feels uncomfortable being transparent about, then you're probably also on the wrong track. Transparency has this really good way of ironing out things that are not right, because people tend to not want to say openly the things that are not quite right. There should be very little going on in the boardroom, in my view, that cannot be transparent to stakeholders. Very few exceptions should be very short-lived. If you're in a public company, for example, those boards can maybe hold something back, but maybe only for 24, 48 hours. So I think we need to be very clear as what is this slide around everything that's legal is not ethical, you know, how you're discharging it and how to do ESG with ethics, integrity, and purpose. On slide 3, I'm illustrating that it all starts with a tone from the top and then being set in the boardroom, and then you can follow and I'm sorry about the small print, I hope you can read it, how it comes around to the board is responsible for having in place a top management that's trustworthy and who acts with integrity. The board is also responsible for the corporate culture being healthy. and it needs to have itself a clear common understanding on why values are important, what basic values are, and how they need to be in place, and how the board is going to oversee it. The board needs to question itself if they have sufficient trust in the top management, because if trust is gone, they've got to address that very clearly. And do they operate in an environment of strong values and strong principles where people can operate in an honest way? And is that following through within the organization? Further down, board members, we're extremely dependent on top management, obviously, but ultimately we can get rid of them. And that's in our gift, but it's also in our gift to ensure that they are there and they're doing the right thing. It's not only in our gift, it's actually a very clear part of our job. In the end, as you can see, it all comes full circle. And I think that it's very clear for board members to not think that there's any escape from being on top of how everything goes in terms of ethics, integrity within the business. And when they don't do that, they will ultimately be responsible for that. So what is the purpose of ethics? I do want to talk, although we're just going through some of it. I think ethics for me is giving people, organizations, the tools for dealing with moral codes and moral complexity. It's also something that government and activists look at, that if when ethics are lacking, you will get actions coming very easily for both government and from activists. And it's something that we're seeing all the time. And it's something that boards should be very aware of. And they should actually make sure that they have already discussed what their response will be to any kind of activist action that will come in, for example, around equality, around their climate ethics and justice, around UN SDGs if they're not following them well enough. And I think what I had seen very much so is that if the firms and industries generally operate ethically and with integrity, they most definitely reduce the risk and impact of actions from both government and activists. Years ago, I worked with 4 different activists that would focus both on private and public companies. They always used governance as the root end, and any weakness in the governance system would be something that would be attached. Well, we would be attached because I was part of looking at these kind of things. And it certainly leaves very much any organization and company very vulnerable when you can first see weaknesses in the board's governance and follow on to that. It's often seen as well that ethics and integrity is missing in the same way. So how do you act ethically and with integrity? And for me, it begins with a clear understanding of core values. I'd love to see all directors be very clear on their own values. What are your top 3 to 5 value words that you know you live by, have lived by now, and will live by going forward? I have mine listed up on my top LinkedIn profile: collaboration, honesty, transparency, and trust. I have worked and lived by those values forever. When I feel in any situation that my values are being pushed around, I will try to influence for it to not happen. And if I can't do that, I will remove myself from the situation, because if I lose my values, I lose my integrity. That's how I look at it. Integrity as a moral purpose, I think is an interesting one, but it's something that I think people should really be clear on. And I think moral integrity and integrity for both individuals and for boards is basically doing the right thing when no one is looking. I think doing the right thing only when it's easiest or the most profitable is pretty easy. Anyone can appear to have a backbone in those kind of situations, but what we're coming up towards in the world and what's moving, it's very hard times that's coming up, and it's the hard times that matters. The hard times could be when doing the wrong thing has a pot of gold at the end of it, or when doing the right thing may end up hurting you. That's when moral integrity of people, of course, reveal itself very, very clearly. And very much so what is said is not as important as what is done. I would love to see a code of ethical conduct for directors globally. I saw that the UK IOD has just issued a code of conduct for directors. But interestingly, I couldn't see the word ethical anywhere in that. And I would like to see ethics as part of any director's code of conduct, because clearly if you put ethical in front of conduct, it becomes something else, right? A code of conduct is one thing, but a code of ethical conduct actually underlines what we're talking about here and the importance of getting the right thing done. I think following on for boards' understanding of their own values, that should feed into the understanding of the values underpinning the organization. Well, how do you develop this common understanding of the right values for the business and the right tone from the top? If your own values are not aligned with the values of the business, that's going to be really difficult. So that's why it is quite important that you understand your own values and how flexible you would be with your own values or not, and how flexible you should be with the values of the company when you have to evidence that you are following them or not. And again, also for boards, they should have clarity on what's the key messages and values that would uphold the right organizational behaviors, integrity and ethical standards. There are many things that would add to moral integrity that leaders have. Generally, you would say a moral leader would definitely take responsibility for their actions. They wouldn't blame other people for whatever went wrong. They will readily admit when they are wrong. They will put the needs of others before their own. A proper leader will effectively create the environment to make other people successful, not for themselves. They will give people the benefit of the doubt when it's necessary, and they will offer to help those in need. And they will always stay humble and be kind. At least this is how I see it. And of course, everyone is different with that. On the final slide, I have different questions that I would recommend boards to ask in the boardroom around ethics and integrity. For example, does the board have awareness of previous breakdowns in ethical conducts? It's very important before you join a board to actually know what has happened previously. Another one, have both board members and employees received ethics training? Is this a regular event? It's something that often you don't get. In fact, I haven't actually managed to get that through on any of the boards I'm working with, but I'm working on that because I think it's very important. Are incentive schemes linked to ethical behaviors, and how would you manage that? How would you measure it if it's ethical or not? How do you talk about it and make sure it's something that's happening? And how does the board monitor and follow corporate culture and values? These are something that most boards are not very closely aligned into and are not asking themselves. But it would be good if these questions could all enter into the boardroom as boards go along, because I think it will significantly increase the chances of boards doing the right thing ethically, as opposed to claiming ignorance, because I just don't think that follows anymore. So finally, I will just hope that this will lead into, well, sort of underpinning the discussions in the upcoming week, and that you would eventually come away with fresh clarity of how to push boards forward, both ethically and with integrity as directors. Thank you very much.
Excellent backdrop. Sorry, my apologies for not putting on my mic properly. Thank you very much. I think your remarks provide a very excellent backdrop for our discussions this week. And I think I like your point of the need for us to talk about these things like values and ethics. Sometimes we find those difficult conversations and that they're very fluffy and take too long and not very focused, but it really is important for us to have those discussions before we have the ethical dilemmas to decide upon. Indeed. But let me not try and engage in this discussion, because we have an exciting panel discussion ahead of us, for which our chairman, Mr. Nigel Romano, will be taking the floor as moderator. Without further ado, Chairman Nigel, may I invite you to put on your mic and take over as moderator.
Thank you very much, Faye. and thank you very much, Charlotte, for a very stimulating and thought-provoking presentation. This afternoon, we have 3 qualified directors and professionals to discuss further. First, we have Oliver Jordan, then we have Indu Sharma and Robbie Rambaran. Oliver from Barbados, Indu, of course, from Trinidad, and Robbie from Guyana. So we are well represented across the Caribbean, both in our panelists and in our participants. Oliver Jordan is an experienced corporate director and advisor who serves on a number of boards in the private and the public sectors, including the CCGI. He's currently the chairman of the Financial Services Commission of Barbados, with responsibility for regulating the non-bank financial institutions on the island. These include insurance companies, credit unions, pension plans, mutual funds, and security companies. He also serves as the chairman of the Corporate Governance and Strategy Committee of the Financial Services Commission. In May 2022, Oliver was appointed as special advisor to the Minister of Finance in Barbados for the reform and restructuring of state-owned entities. Some of his previous roles included Managing Director Barbados and Eastern Caribbean at CIBC First Caribbean, Partner for Advisory Services with PwC Eastern Caribbean, and Chief Operating Officer for ICBL, the largest general insurance company in Barbados. Oliver has recently completed the Director Education Program at Rotman School of Business at the University of Toronto and holds the ICD designation from the Institute of Corporate Directors of Canada. Indu is an independent consultant, having spent the majority of her career in the Trinidad and Tobago energy sector at senior executive and board levels with several multinational companies such as GDF Suez, Centrica, and Methanex. At Methanex, she was most recently responsible as she was the business development director and was responsible for strengthening the site's governance infrastructure, risk management, and managing key stakeholder relationships, including government relations. She's an attorney at law with over 30 years experience in the areas of corporate and commercial law, energy, and banking. She's currently the managing partner of the legal firm of Nass Sharma and Company, which focuses on conveyancing, probate, and succession in corporate and commercial law. Indu has a passion for governance and establishing practical and bespoke corporate frameworks in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals for small, medium, and large enterprises, both privately owned as well as publicly traded in the Caribbean. Robbie, last but not least, has over 20 years of experience in the public and private sectors. He's passionate about corporate governance and wants to see an improvement in how organizations are led and managed by the board and top management team. He holds an MBA. His range of skills include supply chain management, procurement, and healthcare management. He is currently the CEO acting of Georgetown Public Hospital Corporation, Guyana's national hospital. He previously served as a procurement specialist on World Bank and UNICEF-funded projects for the Ministry of Education in Guyana. He's also heavily involved in sports administration, and as such, has served as a member director of the Essequibo Cricket Board, the Pele Football Club, Guyana Football Federation, and the Guyana Country Coordinating Mechanism Global Fund Board. He's also a member of the Ministry of Amerindian Affairs Tender Board and chairman of the Burns Memorial Presbyterian Church. He previously served on the board for many years, holding specific financial responsibilities. So I'm now going to ask Oliver to lead off, and followed by Indu and Robbie on a few remarks on the theme ethics, integrity, and purpose. Oliver?
Thanks, Nigel. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here. First, I want to thank Charlotte for a very thought-provoking presentation. I believe that the notion of developing a conscience of the board is very relevant for us as directors As she said, we are at the top of the organization, and we do have a role and responsibility for ensuring that there's honesty, integrity, fairness, etc., in respect of how the companies operate. In effect, boards must be the guardrails for management. And I think, as Charlotte said, when firms operate ethically and with integrity, they reduce the risk of an impact to actions from governments and activists. So I think where we want to focus the discussion is really on how we can become better stewards of that, particularly in the Caribbean where we operate, and talk about how we can provide support for boards and by extension managements to ensure that we build an effective framework for integrity and how we operate across our respective islands. So I'll just pause there and I'll turn it over to Indu before we get into further discussion.
Thank you, Indu.
Thank you, Nigel. Thanks to all the previous speakers as well. This is a very, very exciting opening to Governance Week, and it struck me that the theme of this week's conference for each day is dedicated to a different type of organization. We have the private sector, we have the public sector, we have family businesses and SMEs and conglomerates as well. So we're looking at governance from different perspectives and different contexts. But whichever the context, the issue of ethics and ethical decision-making is the same. Is it, the pithy question is, can the decision stand scrutiny? And decision-making, in my view, is not only about the actual decision that is arrived at, but the process by which the decision is arrived at by the board. So first of all, does it pass the sniff test? And then secondly, what was the thinking and what were the considerations behind the decision that was made? Did the directors exercise due care and attention? Did they act in the interests of the company? What were the considerations taken? So for example, we could talk about in their decision-making, were the interests of stakeholders taken into account? Were stakeholder interests aligned or were they divergent? I think this also necessarily means that directors have an understanding of their roles and responsibilities and take those responsibilities seriously. Some of the practical measures that companies that I've dealt with take would be to, for example, develop a code of conduct for the board. And I was very interested to hear from Charlotte about the code of ethical conduct as well. But codes of conduct that I've seen would include ethical behavior, and these create the expectations of directors. And further than that, how to embed acceptable behaviors and practices within the board and within the organization generally. I think it was also really very timely that Charlotte mentioned, the distinction between legal, what is the baseline legal, but also what is more beyond legal and what could be, the ethical implications of decision. And I think when we're talking about creation of value overall, we need to recognize that ethical decision-making is in the long-term interests of the organization and the entity that we're dealing with as directors. Thank you, Nigel.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Charlotte, wonderful presentation. Professor Bob Garrett, I think if we are to take this context of the discussion in hand, we all probably need to read Stop the Rot and adopt some of that, your principles there, which I find is coincide and is auguring well with this topic of discussion. And I clearly remember reading in your book where you spoke about the set of value to stop. And it's the sense of value was the behavioral, the business value, there was the personal value, and it was the value of corporate governance. And while Kamala CEO spoke about not just for profit, which is the business value. Importantly, we have to look at the personal values. And that's where I think it's kind of lacking, is that directors are not being responsible. And so the whole aspect where ethics and transparency and accountability and conflict of interest and all these things are applicable, I think it's no longer fashionable. It's no longer a gaffe, but we must accept that it's time that we have proper frameworks, governance frameworks. Charlotte spoke about an international code of conduct on ethics. And these are things that I find that obviously is needed. For too long, we have been focusing on transformational leadership, transactional leadership, transactional governance. And it's time for us to have transformational leadership, transformational governance. We are responsible for the future generations. And that's what we have to be very mindful. You know, as the CEO acting of the National Hospital, I said to everyone, and I had a meeting earlier this morning, where we are planning for our future generation. We are planning for our children and our children's children. And this is what we have to ensure happen. And have each organization should have these bylaws that holds the directors. It must be clear, transparent, and that holds them accountable. I find many directors sometimes don't know what their real roles are. Training for directors are essential so that they can help mitigate any uncertainties. They can able to take risk. They can be strategic thinking. They must allows themselves as well to have this human value. So we have to be mindful about all of these things and the concerns of its impact on the future generations. I'm happy to hear the call for an international code of ethics. I think that is quite needed. We have to make our organization successful and satisfying stakeholders as well. And in doing so, a lot has to be built about our professionalism. If I recall, there was in Stop the Rot speaks about rethinking, reestablishing professionalism and our human values, our personal values, so that we can, like Charlotte said in her presentations as well, it starts from the top. And that's where we need to start from, in having these frameworks, good governance frameworks that can allow us to follow and improve and it will have a positive impact on the organizations and the future generations. Thanks.
Thank you, Robbie. The question I'd have for each of you is, purpose is important. I mean, I think we have heard that quite a bit. How many of the organizations that you interact with clearly have a clear defining purpose? And to the extent that you have organizations that do, does the entire organization know that purpose? I mean, from captain to cook, from CEO to janitor, how many of them understand their purpose and how their specific roles contribute to that purpose? Oliver.
Thanks, Angel. What I would say is I think it really comes down to, I would make a distinction between what I've seen in the public sector versus the private sector. I think in the private sector, the purpose is typically quite clear in terms of the business and the profit motive, whereas I find in my experience in the public sector, it's mixed. Many organizations have evolved over a period of time, obviously through changes in government and changes in policy direction. And in many cases, many of the state-owned entities aren't actually clear what their purpose is. They just know there's a lot of activity, but it's not clear. And I think this is where the boards have a critical role to play in helping the organization define what that purpose is, that's something I'm actually looking at doing in Barbados for the whole issue of stable ending reform. We can't reform an organization unless we're clear what the organization exists for. And I think that's the critical thing that needs to be done. As I said, I find it's more of a challenge in the public sector, less in the private sector. I'm not sure what the experience is in, say, Trinidad and Guyana.
Hindu?
Nigel, I think as Oliver alludes to, I mean, it's a mixed bag. It really is a mixed bag depending on the organization. You know, for some state entities, special purpose vehicles, you may have a specific purpose. You know, that's very clear. However, notwithstanding that purpose, there may be other, you know, considerations that come into play. In terms of how the company is acting or what business the company engages in and the type of decisions that are made. With SMEs, I think that much depends on the area. It depends on the, you know, for example, if it is the energy sector, there may be specific types of operations that they're involved in. However, if it is a family-owned small business, the purpose perhaps may be more related to the objectives of the family rather than a wider appreciation and creation of value within the industry. So I think it largely depends. It's quite a mixed bag. I've seen lots of different organizations. I find though that more and more SMEs are getting, you know, to grips with this whole purpose and this issue of values, and it's very heartening to see, because at the end of the day, many family-owned businesses that I serve are looking at legacy, and they're looking at the sustainability of the organizations and considering the purpose very focused way, and considering the values and identifying the values and living to those values is what drives sustainability and legacy within SMEs, small organizations.
Thank you, Robbie.
Nigel, it's very fundamental that everyone is on the same page, from, like you said, from captain to cook, from CEO to janitor. It's like yesterday we had a bit of discussion, and I was saying that sometimes directors are much for the titles and the perks that comes with it, and not necessarily knowing what their full responsibilities are. The methodology and sometimes of which we select directors and boards are allowing those sorts of behavior. If I could recall, there was in Curacao where they actually advertise, whether it's state-owned enterprises or a private company, they would advertise actually for their directors and not just a handpick or a political affiliations, and people who are diverse in the organization operations. When you have a structure that allows full participation, and many of the directors, I have directors sitting on boards, and if you ask them what is the mission and vision of the organization, they don't know. And even though it's like Hindu said, a state-owned enterprise where they have defined objectives, sometimes they still don't know. But it is a responsibility from as head of an institution where I'm trying to create profile of the institution that can actually share it with everyone. So everyone trying to create a more enabling, empowering environment where you have a team and not just individualism. The individualism sometimes is what really causes this dysfunctional of people not knowing what to do. So it is a form of responsibility to have that transcend. And like I've said to my HR people, there is a package you should receive when you're employed. And that package is what will help to shape your own personal and your own personal values and that of which impact the institution as well.
Thank you. Oliver, I want to take you up on a point. You said that private sector profit motive. Is profit ability a purpose or an outcome of fulfilling purpose? And do enough organizations and boards understand the difference?
Yes, I agree. Profit is the outcome of purpose. And yes, you're correct. Again, there's a mixed bag. Some people have very clearly defined purpose. Some it's a little bit gray. So.
Because I think there's this tension between results, profitability, and what Adam Grant refers to as relationship, the relationship with the stakeholders, all stakeholders, and the implications of that for sustainability. And in a number of cases, one has to balance between the short term and the long term, between, as Kamla said earlier, people, planet, and profit. How many organizations do you think appreciate that? And I'll start with Indu and come back to you.
Well, Nigel, I think that people and organizations, directors and organizations are waking up to the reality that short-term profit can be at the expense of long-term sustainability. And, this is a tension. This is the dilemma in a very increasingly competitive environment. Also, I would say that one of the drivers that has sort of militated this change is the fact that investors are very, very aware of the decisions that the companies that they invest in are making, particularly around the environmental and social governance of those companies. So this can be very much investor driven, where investors are demanding. We're seeing much more increased investor activism in the global markets, in the capital markets. And this is one of the big drivers for a lot of organizations, changing their tack a little bit and trying to make sure that they do take into account the interests of a wider range of stakeholders, not just shareholders. So we're seeing that a lot in the private sector. I don't know if we have time to go into a lot of detail around the state sector, but I do think that we are seeing a lot of investor activism, and that is driving a little bit more close attention being paid to a wider stakeholder group.
Thank you. Oliver?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing is that I think there's a responsibility for directors to balance all stakeholder interests. Again, I think it's a measure that some directors, I think Robbie mentioned it, aren't quite clear on what their responsibilities are. Some people just like the notion of being appointed to the board. I think this is where the whole idea of director training is going to be absolutely critical for us as we move forward, just to help people understand, my responsibility as a director encompasses responsibility to everyone. What are the risks that I need to consider? As was mentioned earlier, what is the process of decision making? It's not just about the outcome, it's the process. So I think this is where I think the whole notion of training is going to be absolutely critical for us as we move forward. And again, I think this is a role where I think CCGI can be absolutely vital.
Thank you, Robbie. Is the hospital for profit or not?
Not for profit. But healthcare profit is a thing by itself. I don't want even to get into the cost for healthcare because, in my opinion, doctors are prolonging people's death for the sake of making money, and it's very unethical. And it's the good medicines. It's move away from good medicine for making money, and it's not an issue in Guyana. Even to the United States of America, as big as they are, they have one of a very dysfunctional healthcare as when it comes to financing. But I think we for boards that are focusing on profit, like Charlotte said, everything that is legal, it's not ethical. And this is where profits drives certain unethical decisions making, because of their focus is more on the profit, but not more on delivering a service that they set out for. So every time it comes to think about it, I just believe that people wishes to make back their investment overnight, rather than have a strategic intent of it, and how they formulate and implement that, but they just look at and that leads to a lot of things. Like one of my background is procurement, leads to price gouging, and price gouging because of someone will have a distributorship for a specific country, and because of having that distributorship and their focus is on profitability, they end up in price gouging. And those are decisions from the top. And when the lower end are aware of these things, like for example, I'll give you a typical example. In the oil industry in Guyana, currently now, if you picked up the paper, you will see that there is a Trinidadian company that is having its fair share because the government passed a law for local content, which says you have to have for certain services is only for the local. This company went ahead and sold. This is a company that claims they have billions of dollars of investment. And they sold 75% of the shares to a Trinidadian Guyanese who never came to Guyana for 210 million Guyana dollars. How do you sell? You're claiming to be a billion investment company, but you are selling 75% of your share for 210 million Guyana dollars. And this is coming from the top. And that was fueling greed for profit, because they wanted to get into the business, the small portion of the services that are set aside for the locals. They want to tap into that, all because of making a profit, making money.
Indu? Very interesting. Indu?
Yes, I find Robbie's comments about the state sector really very enlightening, and perhaps we could shed a little light or share a little bit about some of the aspects of the state sector here in Trinidad, because very often, and this, not calling in company names and so, but sometimes what we find is that state sector companies have not produced their accounts for many years. So it's very difficult as a director, if you're coming onto a state board, perhaps you don't know this before you arrive on the state board, and then you find within the company that the accounts have not been produced. And when those inquiries start and accounts are brought up to date, you realize that the company may not be in a healthy, the balance sheet may not be very healthy. So these are dichotomies that we face as directors if we serve on state boards, because we have a responsibility, in relation to the economic health of the company. So I thought the comments that Robbie was making about not being, or the hospital not being a for-profit company was very interesting, because we have a lot of state companies here in Trinidad, and the fact is many of them do not make a profit.
I see Dr. Farrell has a very good question, and I'm going to read it, his comment and the question. We all claim to subscribe to the same core values articulated by Charlotte: honesty, integrity, yada, 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 as they would say. Why then do boards, Enron, and he gives some very interesting examples, Enron, Carillion, Credit Suisse, I suppose we could give some local examples, end up making unethical choices? Is the answer to be found in the recent work of social psychologists that faced with ethical dilemmas, all of us may engage in ethical feeding, moral disengagement, and other ways of justifying our conduct. I'm going to take a stab at answering the question, because I believe that if your purpose is clear, and I define purpose very clearly in terms of who your organization or is set up to create value for, and those values are very clearly articulated, that it is difficult to get into that feeling and that moving away. I think in a number of these cases, the focus was on short-term profitability and making money as quickly as possible. If you go through the 2008 financial crisis, it was all about the theory of the greater fool. Getting those loans on the books, off the books, whatever, without any regard for the communities those companies were serving, the customers they were supposedly serving, and whether the model was sustainable from a value creation point of view. So the question is, are you creating value, and who are you creating value for? And that's not an easy question to answer, because in my mind, any conversation around value has two questions: of value to whom and for what. And if your board is not engaging in those conversations, and lastly, in the case of Robbie, for instance, Robbie has to create value. He has to create medical well-being or healthy well-being for his patients. But he also has to do that in a way that is able to, in the context of the resources he's been provided, because he doesn't have a bottomless source of funds. So for me, in his situation, while profitability may not be the overarching metric, but he has to be able to define the value he's creating and ensure that he's able to create that value as efficiently and effectively as possible for the people of Guyana who are funding his organization. But let me take it over to you.
Nigel,
you had your hand up.
Yes, and I really appreciate the question because it's one of those really difficult ones. But I do think that the composition of your board is a factor that makes a difference, particularly in those historical cases, with Enron and so on. We saw on boards in those days networks of closely related people, perhaps friends and associates. And so I think sometimes it is very easy perhaps to go with the flow, and sometimes we find that even here in Trinidad, in state companies, for example, we go with the flow. And we don't often speak out. We are not confident enough to speak out. And perhaps that also speaks to training of directors sometimes. And so this is a little bit of a plug for diversity, equity, and inclusion, where you're breaking those networks of individuals that are somewhat complicit and aligned, so closely aligned that there's no perhaps challenge and there's no opposition, or there's no real interrogation of an issue that might be before the board.
Clever?
Yeah, I think going back to what was said at the beginning of this conversation, which is that the board sets the tone at the top, I think is absolutely critical for us to focus on that. Ultimately, I think the board has to create the environment where it's clear that any deviation from ethics will not be tolerated under any circumstances, no matter the motive. If you look at the situations that were mentioned by Dr. Farrells, for example, say Enron, it was really management that was driving that. Can't say how involved the board was, but clearly it was largely driven by management. I think if the board had really set the direction that says, this is what we're prepared to do, this is what we are, this is our boundaries, then I think it's more likely management would have not gone as far as it did. So I think for me personally, I think it points again to why it's so important that the board sets that tone clearly, and the management then hears that, and the management is held accountable if there's any deviations from that tone that's set.
Robbie?
I'm with Edu, and like I said earlier, composition of boards is very critical. For a state-owned enterprise, most times their appointments are political. And this will lead into another conversation we'll have later in the week, where we will talk about qualified directors on boards. It comes to the point that, and I see Liz asked the question as well about performance assessments of board directors. But then when you are volunteering on a board or a state-owned enterprise, and you more or less, once the title, who will, and it's someone's volunteer you there, not you by yourself volunteering your availability, then there is so much of who will enforce the ethical standards. For example, people don't want to sit on the board because they have to submit to the Integrity Commission on state-owned enterprises. Then who evaluates them, right? For non-state-owned enterprises, the question is, who evaluates the directors? The shareholders? But then how much of it, how many shareholders really and truly has the capability to read a financial statement, to know the health of the institutions, and how to hold their directors responsible? And oftentimes is when there is a vacancy, the vacancy is filled based on the recommendation of the boards itself, and not necessarily a process of selection. So who does the evaluating? Who hold the directors accountable, and ensure the ethical standards and transparency is maintained? It has to be ourselves. It has to be the directors themselves. Typically, the human service, the human values of it. So it starts with us, the top. It starts with us.
Let me open it up to the all participants to please jump in with your questions. Unmute yourselves and go ahead. But Oliver, you wanted to say something?
No, sorry, that was my mistake.
Liz, you want to jump in at the start of the conversation?
I see. I think it's important. And I think, Robbie kind of touched on it. Yes, we have a responsibility. But I think a lot of directors lack the confidence. I don't know if it's confidence, or they certainly lack the willpower to say exactly how they feel. And if they would see for sure directors clearly arriving at meetings, opening the package at meetings, and not even question that. I've always found myself to be the lone voice on a board saying, you know what, I think we need to be putting things on the table. We need to be bringing things to this meeting, bringing things to the discussion. But clearly you could see that persons haven't read anything. They can't contribute to the conversation, and they just basically go along with the flow. And so, I've always had a concern about that. And I, like our main speaker, have walked away from situations where even though I've expressed my feelings about, persons not being able to make a valuable contribution and, underscoring it, and still nothing has happened. So I really can't see myself. I couldn't see myself in a situation where, because I would feel that I'm contributing to this issue as well. Yeah, but it's getting that voice, that collective voice of the board. If you don't have an evaluation process, the chairman of the board has a role to play in determining whether somebody's adding value to the conversation. But, sometimes, especially when it comes to state boards, and it's even more difficult when it comes to family-owned companies as well, because it may be somebody's been selected on the board who is a friend of one of the persons the shareholders who owned the company and all of that. So it's a vicious cycle, I think, that we're caught up in sometimes as directors. And if you don't get the persons to perhaps share a conviction or have a conviction. It's difficult to, with no assessments in place, because I have found too, the older directors, they're not interested in assessments. Assessments list? What are you talking about? Assessments. I mean, meaning that, well, you know, we have been selected here by virtue of, I guess, their experience, their connections, probably their finances as well. So yeah, I think, yeah, it's something that I'm hopefully going to help to change with in whatever little way I can, in trying to get people to speak out when it's necessary. And for boards to particularly, you know, you say exactly how you feel. And if something is not going the way it should go, you should be able to be not afraid to. And fortunately, women tend to express themselves a little bit more than men. So.
Nigel,
yeah.
If
let's hear from Sharon, Robbie.
Go ahead.
Sharon.
I'm a company secretary by profession. I work primarily with state boards. You know, the problem state boards, and I keep talking about the recruitment and selection process, and why is it different for the state sector? Okay, so it's political, but why can't the politicians and the ministries go through a formal, rigorous recruitment and selection process for persons to go on state boards? In the state sector, the bulk of the work is done by the state enterprise. Right? The ministry will play an overseeing role, but the bulk of the work for the country is done by the state enterprise. It is important, the persons that you put on the state boards. It can't be just a wishy-washy process. It has the person that you are, the core character of the individual, that is the person that is going into the boardroom, right? And we keep making that link between personal values and company purpose. We don't want a variance between words and actions. We want to be reflected in actions. And therefore the nature and the character of the individual on the board is important. And you can get to that through starting with a vigorous recruitment and selection process. While the person's on the board, yes, you'll have assessments and you have to, of course, if somebody doesn't have the time and all of that, you have those processes while the person's on the board. But it's very important from the get-go to get the round pegs in round holes. I have a 3-year-old son. I saw him trying to put a square peg into his little round thing. It did not fit. It cannot fit. Okay, we need the round pegs, round holes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That's spot on. Charlotte, I'd like you to come in and comment on what on your thoughts on what you have heard so far.
I do think what was said earlier by Indu, like the board composition is the core of it, right? And what Sharon was saying as well, you really have to get that right. That's the heart of everything we do. And I think Robbie was mentioning that too. It's just, you get the wrong people there and they can't regulate themselves and that work in self-interest, everything is lost. And the whole, I mean, the governance is an overriding piece of everything, obviously. But if that's done without ethics and integrity, then it's worth nothing, right? And I think that's where things fall down often. That's why I see, I mean, I was part of an $8 billion merger of 2 listed companies, one in the UK and one in the US. And whilst we're getting to the end of that merger, we were having some really interesting discussions with the bankers that were going to value everything for the price of the actual deal. And they were so convoluted. I was listening to them and I was chairing the company that was being targeted. And I said, look, why this is so convoluted? You should not have such convoluted discussions. And the only reason it's convoluted is you're trying to do something that is not right, right? We're going to do this fully transparently and in the right way. And they said, oh, but then the deal can fall. I said, if the deal falls because we're transparent, then the deal was never made to happen. And I think sometimes you have to go to those difficult places and be that person who will say the thing that nobody wants to hear. And if you can't be that leader, then I think you should consider your position on any board.
Exactly. Professor Bob Garrett, do you want to comment on anything you've heard so far?
Thanks. Yeah, it's making me feel personally uncomfortable, but I'll explain why in a second. If I go back to Dr. Farrell's intervention, which I thought was very interesting indeed, on the notion of fading, ethical fading. When we were doing this conversation leading up to the founding of the Chartered Director in the UK, so this is a series of conversations in the late 1980s. There were three fundamental values that were being discussed as absolutely critical to what we were trying to do. One was accountability, one was probity or honesty, and one was transparency. And everybody we talked to said, that's wonderful, that's exactly what we need. But then if you ask the question, to whom should you be accountable? To whom should you be honest? And to whom should you be transparent? Then all sorts of problems arose in terms of exactly what a board member should be doing. And I take Dr. Farrell's comment. I came at it from a slightly different angle, but from the same thing, from the field of anthropology. And there are many different types of culture, but two of the fundamental types of culture you find in anthropology are whether a society has a guilt culture or a shame culture. And the guilt culture is when you have total, absolute personal responsibility for what you're doing. And you're most probably answerable in the end to your God. The shame culture is when you are responsible, but to the group or the groups within which you work. And that's where the fading comes in, because the tension between those two is often very great indeed. And sadly, most people tend to, in the end, slip into the shame culture that I don't want to be excluded from that group, rather than I'm going to stand on my own on that decision. That's very tricky. And it's unresolved, and it will go on, I think, forever, but we need to be clear in our own minds what we're doing. My personal discomfort at the moment is that about 10 years ago, I was approached by a group of medics who had a brilliant idea and put together some money to buy the intellectual property rights of a particular molecule. Now, I'm not sure whether it's ethical to buy molecules or not, but that's what they did. And it's taken a long time for a small group of people to go through nearly all the phases of testing of this molecule now. Certainly in the UK and now increasingly in the US. And it is proving a remarkable molecule. It looks as though, and we're very close to final proof of this, that a single drop of this molecule put in the nose can reset the human immune system for at least 2 weeks to stop asthma. Now that is mind-boggling as a statement. Now, as I say, the testing is continuing, etc. The group have finally been given $50 million to really take this right on towards the end of the testing process. They, I think, personally unwisely, have just moved to California. And as soon as they got there, they were being told, well, you don't need $50 million investment. We can put 10 times that amount in. They start talking billions now. Now, this is absolute world beater. Go for it. You will all be incredibly personally rich. Okay. And the one problem is the person who's offering them the billions has said, I want to buy the whole thing. I want to buy all of you out, but I then want to kill the product. It may do humanity a great deal of good, but I make nebulizers. And there's no way I want to lose the global nebulizer market. Now there's an ethical problem for a board. What do you do when you're seemingly on the crest of a success wave, and yet everything you've put into for the last 10 years could be killed by the signing of a check? Very tricky.
Very tricky.
Have any comment?
Well, again, that is a moral dilemma, as Charlotte properly said, moral complexity. And then it goes back to purpose. Why did you develop this enterprise, and why did you invest in this molecule? What was your purpose? And then one has to weigh the long-term benefit that one can create against the short-term opportunity. So an interesting problem to have, I must say.
It's actually quite a frightening problem to have.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. But again, we are all faced with those kinds of dilemmas every day. And for me, if we have, if we are true to our values, whatever those values are, and they're clear about our purpose, I'm not saying it makes it a slam dunk, but it makes it easier to have the conversation to get to a decision. I won't say a right or a wrong decision, but to get to a decision that is consistent with those values and with whatever that purpose is. Cavell, you want to come in? I see you're conversing.
Yes, I was about to share that there's a very active chat that is going on alongside the discussion.
Let's verbalize the chat. Where is Cavell?
I am right here, Nigel. Just now.
So go ahead.
No.
There you are.
Yeah, I'm multitasking. So sorry, I apologize. I just came out of a noisy room.
Okay,
yes, what I'll say is, I mean, especially being involved on state boards, private sector boards, and NGOs, I find the challenge often is managing, you see, the conversation around ethics earlier and what your personal core values are and being guided by that, you find sometimes there's conflict with your standards and your values versus other board members. And you see hidden agendas coming out from time to time where people serve on boards and they serve for their own self-interest and not in the interest of the organization, especially with NGOs where you don't necessarily attract always the best talent to your board because it's not a paying, you don't even get a stipend. And even with state boards, the stipends are very low as well too. So sometimes the lack of compensation, although you shouldn't be volunteering if that is your agenda, but sometimes people come onto NGOs to advance their business, their personal interests, and not serve the interests of the organization, and they're not working in unison with the board members. And it creates a difficulty, especially managing meetings, managing confidentiality, where they're taking information from board meetings and using it for their personal interests as well too. And these are some of the challenges that NGOs face, you know, and it's the kind of support we need from your organization, Nigel, in terms of training directors and getting them to understand, you know, what serving on a board actually means, you know, and getting the necessary skills in place and making it affordable too for NGOs to send their directors on some of the training as well. So I'm just making a plug as well, right?
No, very good. I mean, Kamala is listening, so I'm sure she will respond appropriately. But I have to say that
Nigel, we have a plan.
All right, good. So Simon, I'm going to come to you just now, but I want to just make the point that the training is part of it. So educating people as to the reason for the board, the role of the board, making sure that they understand very clearly that the purpose of the organization and the role of core values and value creation, and being very specific about that. But in addition to that, the organizations have to have structures in place to evaluate board members and to ensure that all board members are heard, and that where behavior that is not consistent with the core values and the purpose arises, it is addressed, and those perpetuating that kind of behavior are confronted. So Simon, let's hear from you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So yes, we were talking in the chat, and I'm on a few NGO boards, and having worked in the public sector most of my career, I have seen some very interesting things. I think the issue for me is one of not only accountability, but culpability. Sometimes people feel because they are volunteering for a job, or they, especially in the state sector too, they feel they, they're not being paid appropriately for their time. They feel as if that gives them a pass to give kind of substandard service. They don't necessarily care about, what happened, because they say, well, they pay me to be here, I just give them whatever I could, that kind of very slapdash, very ad hoc kind of thing. And it concerns me because, when you tell them, especially when you're the lone attorney on the board, people look to you because they assume, especially in an NGO, there are no corporate secretaries per se in some of them. You're the lawyer and they look to you, and I'm like, there's issues of accountability, and there's no severability where these decisions are taken, especially with donor money and all of that, and I'm always very concerned because I find the NGOs need that kind of support and that kind of training, because sometimes you can't attract the best talent because there are no bragging rights for some of these things. They're not very sexy topics. Nobody wants to take the time to dedicate to do these things because it's often very thankless, very, 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 I want to say it's kind of drudgery. You have to go down into the trenches in some of these things and do them yourself. So I think there's work we need to do in terms of making the corporate governance side of things, even for NGOs, a little more interesting for people, because I will go back to the boards and I will be there preaching on my soapbox. No takers, but we do what we can do. But I just wanted to flag that as another issue that I have picked up over the years. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Indu? And while Indu is going to chat, please note that Christy has asked us to complete the post-event survey before we leave. So while we're doing that, please take some time to do that. Indu?
Yes, thank you, Nigel. I thought it was really interesting that Professor Garrett spoke about the guilt culture as opposed to the shame culture, because I think that tied in very much with what we would call in Trinidad going with the flow. And perhaps, we need to be a little more forthright and confident in speaking out. But I also wanted to say that very much, how the board operates and how it sets the tone for the organization should be from the chairman. And having a strong chairman is not to be underestimated, because the chair really is the one who will work very closely with the corporate secretary to set the agenda, but also can be the individual that leads the evaluation of the board as a board, as well as managing the relationship between the directors and managing the relationship with the CEO as well. So I think, make that, you can't underscore that too much. You really need to have a strong chair to be able to take your organization forward from a governance point of view.
Yeah, and I think the chair's role is critical within the framework. And this is why I am so pleased with the ISO 37000. Their whole focus on purpose, values, value creation, and how that value is created. It's not just creating value, because I think Adam Grant is the one who said that tension between results and relationship. I can focus on getting all the results I want at the expense of the team. However you define that team, whether it's your employees or your customers, your suppliers or your shareholders or the regulators. But it is important that you understand that you create that value in the context of a community. And that if you want to be in that community for any length of time, one has to craft the purpose and the values in that context. We're almost at the end, and I want to hand it over to Charlotte to wrap us up, to give us a few words of wisdom. I think we had a very healthy discussion, initiated by you, Charlotte, so thank you. So give us a few parting words of wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been really lovely hearing how engaged the participants are with this. Please continue to be that. Having the conversations, I think, is what we can learn from, mostly all of us, and sharing the knowledge that we build up and the kind of issues that we meet. It seems to be a good lead-in, I think, to a week if you continue having discussions like this and bringing various issues to the table. I think that is super important. I am a big black and white on my views on right and wrong. It is how I am, and some boards are finding that difficult, but it is the only way I can serve a board. I need things to be right, and I need everybody to try to do the best they can and be that role model, because we all are when we serve on boards. We're role models to so many other people. And with everything that goes on in the world, I think that it's incredibly important that we as leaders can stand up for what is right and show the way for ethics and integrity to prevail in the boardroom.
Thank you very much. I want to leave us with that comment from Kushina Sukram Quintal, a strong chairman, but a strong chairman who understands that he's first among equals, and that his job is to, or his or her job is to promote the purpose of the organization, not his or her own personal agenda. So yes, very much so, very, very important. Faye or Kamla, you want to end it for us?
Thank you, Nigel, and many thanks to the panel. I think we had such an engaging discussion and pulled up a lot of strands of all the different aspects the board conscience has to weave together to really get us to where we want to go. I believe Kamla would like to close us off for the day and wrap things up. So Kamla, can I invite you to take your mic, open up your mic and close us off for the day?
Yes, thank you very much, Faye. I really have enjoyed today's opening ceremony. I mean, it lived up to expectations. And Charlotte, you can see that this is what our community in the Caribbean is like. We really are all keen in understanding, growing, and trying to help each other, because
fantastic.
The answers, yes, thank you. The answers are not easy sometimes, but we can support, nurture, help each other. And I wanted to say to Cavell that, yes, we understand that even us at CCGI, we have a responsibility to help grow our NGOs as well, to ensure that there's some training offered for directors there who are volunteering their time so that they can help be more effective with their organizations as well. So I'm putting, and I don't mean to put her on the spot, but I'm putting Claire Gomez Miller on notice. We'd be looking to organizations like her own, led by people like herself, who have a tremendous interest in and ability, you know, in terms of governance and strong leadership, to provide more support for us so that we too can do so much more. I think this week is going to be an amazing one that's going to allow us to build on a lot of the discussions that has been raised here today. And I really look forward to all of it.